"Sir, could you pretend to be my daddy? Just for one day?" The little girl pleaded with Big Shaq. And one request changed everything. When a billionaire black CEO is accused of abducting a mysterious little girl, the truth threatens to expose a system built on silence. Buried behind a red door lies a mother's voice, a father's secret, and a child's memory no one believed. In a world where skin is seen before character, can one man protect the truth without losing everything? Some families are chosen, some are revealed, and some were never supposed to be found. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was a warm Georgia afternoon, the kind where the sun poured down like honey on concrete, and even time seemed to move slower. The park buzzed with laughter, strollers, and the rhythm of normal lives unbothered by anything deeper than a phone screen or a spilled coffee. In a custom-tailored gray suit, Big Shaq strolled without guards or assistants, his 6'7" frame drawing glances, not because of fame, but because of presence. He was a self-made storm, who had learned to walk like peace. The CEO of one of the country's top media tech firms, Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal, was known for much more than his millions. He built scholarships before software, built trust before businesses, and still, there was something in him today that felt restless. He'd always said he came to the park when the boardroom noise got too loud, when silence wasn't enough. Something about watching kids play, mothers yelling, old folks feeding pigeons, it reminded him what mattered. But today, none of that stilled him. He passed the basketball courts, nodded at a couple of young men who tried to act like they didn't recognize him. Fame wasn't the armor people thought. Sometimes it made you bleed louder. That's when he saw her. She sat on the far bench under the statue of a war hero nobody really remembered. She couldn't have been more than 7. Skin the color of worn caramel, hair wild in tiny curls, clothes faded but not dirty. There was no toy, no snack, no backpack beside her, just a stillness too unnatural for a child. She was staring at a pigeon pecking at old bread, like it held the answers to her life. He felt it immediately, that knot in his chest, that whisper from the soul that said, "Pay attention." Shaq slowed his pace, almost unsure if he should approach. His mind shouted caution, a black man walking toward a lone child in a public park. The world would never see kindness in that image. But his heart pressed forward. She looked up before he even reached her, eyes too wide, too hollow. And then, as if she knew him, or maybe knew of him, she asked the question that would haunt him forever. "Sir, could you pretend to be my daddy just for one day?" There was no stutter in her voice, no performance. It wasn't a game. It wasn't a scheme. It was a plea so raw, so stripped of calculation, that it made the ground feel off balance. Shaq blinked. He'd been in million-dollar negotiations, stood before presidents, but he had no script for this. He didn't answer immediately. The park sounds faded behind the roaring, in his ears. The girl, Lennox, as he would later learn, simply held his gaze, like she was waiting on a verdict from the sky. Her question opened something in him, not just sympathy, something older, something buried. The memory of a little boy in foster care, too big for his age, too dark for comfort, who once asked a pastor to pretend to. That boy was Shaq, and that memory, he had sealed it away beneath success and smiles. He sat beside her, not too close, just enough to let her know he was listening. She didn't say much else at first. Just sat there, kicking her feet lightly against the bench's base like any kid would. But the weight of her silence was louder than any story. She didn't cry. Kids who cry are still hoping someone's listening. Lennox had passed hope. She was already in survival. Shaq asked gently where her parents were. Her reply was cold but precise. "Mama said I was too much noise." That was it. No anger, no heartbreak, just the line of a child who learned too early that love could have limits. He offered her food. She shook her head, asked if she needed help. She shrugged. What she needed was clear, but what she trusted wasn't. Still, she didn't move when he stood. She didn't flinch when he offered his hand. And when she took it, her small fingers barely wrapping around one of his, it felt like signing a contract with pain itself. As they walked out of the park, whispers rose like smoke. A black man in a suit, holding the hand of a ragged little girl who didn't match his skin tone or his zip code. America didn't like that story unless it had a white savior or a police escort. He felt the stairs tighten like noose ropes, heard a voice behind him mutter, Ain't that the CEO guy? Then another, what's he doing with her? But he kept walking. He called his driver to meet them at the corner. Lennox didn't ask where they were going. She didn't seem to care. She stared out the tinted car window like she was watching a movie she'd seen too many times. Shaq called his executive assistant, canceled his meetings, then called his mother, Lucille, the only person who could read his silence better than any therapist. She asked me to pretend, he said softly. Lucille didn't respond with confusion or pity. She sighed, like she'd just exhaled a truth she'd long feared. Then don't pretend, baby. Just be. By the time they reached his estate, Shaq felt the world narrowing. He'd handled crises, market crashes, lawsuits, even betrayal, but nothing like this. This was a different kind of fragile. Lennox walked into the marble-floored foyer like it didn't matter. Her eyes didn't light up. Riches meant nothing to kids, raised in emotional poverty. She wandered toward a painting on the hallway wall, a portrait of Shaq and his brother, Roman, from when they were teens. That's when she paused, looked up at Shaq, tilted her head. That's my uncle, she said. And just like that, everything stopped. Sometimes, it's not the silence that breaks a man. It's the echo of a name never called. Big Shaq sat alone in his private study, late afternoon light bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden streaks across leather-bound books and polished oak floors. The statue of a phoenix in the corner, a gift from his high school classmates after he became a millionaire, glinted in the setting sun. His mind played over Lennox's words again. Could you pretend to be my daddy just for one day? He closed the blinds, bringing the outside world to a hush, compelling himself to reach for clarity amidst chaos. His fingers hovered above the phone's screen as he felt the heavy gravity of responsibility. It wasn't enough to respond with kindness. He had to know whether this child was safe, who she was, and why she believed he could fill a void she'd endured. Lennox Rain. The name he whispered into the gloom felt like a declaration of purpose. A name is more than letters. It's an invitation to know, to claim, to belong. And she belonged to no one. He began with the public records. His legal counsel, Marisa Blake, an expert in civil law, combed through databases. But there it was again, nothing. No birth certificate matching Tallahassee, Atlanta, Charlotte, nothing. Every query he sent pinged back empty. It was as if Lennox had entered the world without an anchor. Shaq closed his eyes, imagining the terror of a child without origin, without even a spoken name to call home. Still he pressed forward. He asked the local shelters he trusted. Rising Hope, Hope Haven, Sanctuary Gate. Each facility brought apologies and shrugs. No one recalled a girl of Lennox's description. For a child so removed from systems, she might as well exist in whispers. Then came the first unsettling clue. A caseworker in Hope Haven remembered something. A girl who matched Lennox's face, skincare worn raw like emotion. About 2 years ago. She didn't stay long. She left with a woman described as sharp and distant. No address, no final word, a delicate lead, as if a brittle branch reaching water in a desert of missing pieces. Shaq paused, stunned. 2 years ago. The timeline caught at his chest. Something in his spine cracked, and he thought of his brother's funeral. Held in April of that unforgettable year. Roman Rain. The same last name. His throat tightened. Lennox's mother had used his family name, or maybe the courthouse clerk had. Or maybe, just maybe, that name was a bridge between two lives. Shaq never realized, spoke the same language. As darkness swallowed the city's edges, Shaq walked outside to the back terrace. There, where his money built a fortress from the world. He felt walls pressing him inward. He replayed the day in the park. The pink veins in Lennox's cheeks when she whispered her name. The way her eyes widened, as if surprise accompanied the syllables she breathed. Rain. That name didn't belong to any number he had keyed into a database. It just followed her, slipping into his mind like an accusation, like fate. And then came the world of menacing looks. When he drove Lennox home, meaning the lavish mansion he called home, neighbors whispered behind curtains. They watched them walk in him, a black man in a suit, holding the hand of a young biracial girl. Nobody recognized. Rumors bloomed in seconds. A neighbor's text. Did you see Shaq with a random kid? Another, call the cops. Something's off. The color of his skin changed, meaning in white minds. Compassion became crisis. He knew they spoke of him as threat, not savior, but he held her hand tighter anyway, letting dignity guide him when prejudice tried to push him off balance. Inside the house, Lennox wandered the hallways. Each photograph she passed, each piece of artwork, she seemed to watch intently, as though searching for something she'd lost. But Shaq saw the tension in the domestic bliss he'd cultivated. His tech company allowed flexible hours and quiet hours, but emotional hours couldn't be arranged. She sat at the grand piano in the music room, tiny fingers tracing the keys as if unlocking some forbidden melody. He sat across, watching, feeling the gaps between them day by slow day. Marisa returned with more news the next morning. There's no Lennox Rain in the system, no match in welfare offices, hospitals or juvenile services, and the 2-year trace at the shelter is the only lead. Shaq looked at her, swallowing deeply. What about brown vs black? Does the racial disparity show up here? Marisa frowned. It always does. There are children who vanish. Systemic neglect, racial bureaucracies, ignoring darker voices. The girl behind the desk didn't see her. She chose not to. Or she wasn't allowed to. They sat in silence, as sympathy chained itself in Shaq's chest. He closed his eyes and breathed out, tasting the grit of anger. Not at Marisa, but at a system that let a child disappear. A competing shiver came from people who whispered about him, or whispered lies. But it wasn't enough. He had to move beyond database and rumor. He needed someone who'd crossed paths with Lennox's mother. He thought of Pastor Greer and the old church across the street. But he realized shelters and shelters of faith needed scrutiny too. He contacted Rosalind James, the investigative reporter notorious for her tenacity, whose work had crippled discriminatory landlords and racist policing. If there was a trail, Rosalind would find it. But he had to cover the risk, the optics, the scandal, the way a reporter could weaponize a missing child to shred his reputation. Rosalind accepted the assignment, under his name, but looked past it like it was a case, not a favor. She brought files, eviction notices, police dispatch logs, community calls. Lennox's mother had once reported noises in the house, an address in suburban Atlanta. She was Wiss, the landlord calling her that loud black woman. But she'd written it down. It existed. A clue, a flicker of exposure. But the landlord had denied her. The landlord's network's more influential than her words. Racism, again perched on privilege. Shaq felt rage sharpen in his chest at the injustice. But more than that, he felt a promise form in his bones. No longer was this about a singular child needing a father. It was about protecting every child whose name went unspoken. It was about taking on a system so broken, it didn't even register who was hurt. Then came the open threat. Late one night, an unmarked envelope landed on his doorstep. He opened it to find a single photograph, a little girl in a faded pink dress, sleeping in a crib. He recognized the room. It was the same photo Lennox had drawn months ago. On the back, "Don't dig too deep." No signature, no address, just those words, all capital letters, like a tombstone epitaph. Racism had taught him to expect fear. Now he faced fear wielded as weaponized silence. The walls of his mansion felt smaller. The gold-paneled safe he kept in his office for family heirlooms suddenly felt like a storage unit for secrets. He looked at Marisa and Rosalind, the next morning over coffee. The weight of the name he'd given her, and the threat he'd accepted, gathered in the silence of that room. No one spoke, but they both knew this was the point of no return. He was already father, not by birthright but by claim of conscience. He was already a protector, not just a boss. Lennox wasn't a client, or a ward. She was a calling, and the world would have to face him to reach her. The stakes solidified. He arranged for increased security at the mansion, not guards with guns, just presence and protocol. He hired child services advocates to stay ready. But against all this deliberate fortification, he met Lennox at breakfast. She sat quietly, eyes on a bowl of cereal, toy hands still tangled in the spoon. He sat down across from her, and forced a smile that felt like iron in his chest. He touched her small hand across the countertop. "Lennox," he said, voices deeper than announcements at a conference. "You have a name now that I know, and I'm not walking away." She looked up and smiled, uncertain, the slow kind of trust that grows from repeated promises. He ate 2 bites of eggs, slowly. He thought about all the mornings he woke up alone in mansions, the echo of expense but without emotion. That morning, it felt different. The weight of a name was rising. Yes, but so was his purpose. She didn't have to pretend anymore. She just had to be, and he'd be the man those 2 words, my daddy, needed him to be. The day stretched ahead, full of unknowns. But for the first time, as he pushed his coffee away and stood, he felt a steady pulse of resolve. A father isn't someone who fills space. A father is someone who stands when others fall away. Racism might still roar in the air around them, judging, questioning, accusing. But inside those walls, the weight of one name was lifting. Lennox Rain wasn't shadowed by doubt anymore, and Big Shaq was ready to carry the echo of her name, whatever it demanded. He was the face of power, but now they saw a threat in his skin, not a savior in his soul. Big Shaq stepped from the sliding doors of his Beverly Hills villa into a flash of sunlight, but the glare didn't warm the moment, it cut into it. He held Lennox's small hand, guiding her through the manicured courtyard, past sculpted hedges, and the fountain he'd installed for tranquility. But today the fountain's whispers of water felt like an echo chamber. It magnified the tension he carried, made it impossible to ignore the dozen photographers hiding behind camera lenses, 20 feet away. Their shutters snapped like guns, shouting confusion into the air. A black man famed for generosity walking with a young girl. Strangers claimed he stole. The world changed in 60 seconds. A single image of Shaq and Lennox appeared in every major outlet. CEO abducts little girl. Comments filtered in by the thousands. Harsh, punishing, fast. Social media united against him. He's playing abductor. Someone call the police. The tone veered sharply from admiration to suspicion. All those accolades for scholarships and charity evaporated under the weight of a single accusation. Inside the chaos, Shaq didn't falter, but he felt tremors beneath his feet as he ushered Lennox through the back entrance. He sipped her hand like sacred water. This wasn't just media. This was collective fear weaponized by history. If people thought he could kidnap without stirred conscience, what else would they let him get away with? His PR consultant, a lean woman named Felicia Grant, met them inside. Her eyes hinted at concern while her polished voice remained firm. "We need to release a statement. The optics are terrible," she said, adjusting her tablet. Fear could weaken reputations faster than impossible odds in courtrooms. But flashes of potential headlines churned through Shaq's chest. Not headlines he wanted, but ones he was ready to face. He looked at Lennox standing quietly by the grand staircase, clutching a doll. He touched her shoulder before turning back to Felicia. "No release until I know where she came from. Until I prove she belongs to someone who lost her." His words were anchored in conviction. She frowned. "Shaq, we can get ahead of this. Silence isn't misleading. People will assume the worst." He swallowed, feeling both the backlash and the resolve gather together. "Let them assume. I'm not hiding. I'm finding the truth. And I won't trade integrity for likes." Outside the house, cameras roared. Paparazzi stationed along the driveway whispered curses under their breath, wrote fevered updates in live feeds, and pushed each other for angles. An image of Shaq and Lennox was tagged with allegations that would shame any man. Above the full top of the viral feed, the world wanted crisis. So crisis they had. But Shaq refused to step into the light until he could bring clarity, not defensiveness. He stepped into his leather-backed office. Soft rain tapped the window. The world didn't stop just because its corners were cruel. He dialed Marisa. She answered on the third ring. "They're calling your guy a kidnapping suspect." Her voice was charred with worry. "I can contest it, but the press has no filter. Once they decide a story, they own the narrative until it develops." He absorbed her words, drumming his fingers on the mahogany desk. Images of Lennox, distant in the foyer, filtered his focus. "Then we make our narrative bigger. The only story I want out there. Protecting a child." His voice held metallic steel. "Find the shelter she visited. Get their camera footage. Contact that caseworker. Blink, and I'll go on camera myself." Marisa responded with speed and professionalism. "Footage's formatting sucks, but I'll make copies. Caseworker needs subpoena." "No subpoenas," Shaq interjected quietly. "Discretion. No waves. Find what we need without shaking the tree." Marisa exhaled. She knew his approach. Powerful, unseen, determined, understood. She hung up. Across the room, Lennox traced the patterns in the marble floor. He crouched beside her, voice calm. "You okay?" She kept head bowed, whispering, "They think you're my kidnapper." Her voice flittered but stayed steady. She looked at him. "Will you stand by me?" He smiled. "A promise, not a gift. I'll stand in front of them all, if that's what it takes." Downstairs he reviewed footage from Rising Hope Shelter. Lousy quality, grainy, Dark, but the timestamp matched. There, 2 years ago, a girl matching Lennox's exact face walked in with a woman he assumed was her mother. The mother spoke softly, took notebooks from her bag, whispered instructions, then left with the girl. The caseworker handed her a paper. On it was the name Rain. No first name, just Rain. Snowed by gratitude. Shaq's resolve turned warmer. Powerful. He asked Marisa to coordinate with the caseworker, without legal formalities. We don't want enemies. We want truth. As the pieces fit, media storm raged. Conservative outlets panned him. Liberal ones hesitated. The spinning carousel of tweets, shares and likes had no exit strategy. This case is complex, a commentator murmured on CNN. Accusations weigh heavily. Inside they moved silently. Shaq spent the afternoon tending to Lennox's needs, offering her a glass of orange juice, helping her trace sunlight on the floor. He didn't admit that fear clawed at his belly. He wouldn't. Not yet. In his wildest dreams as a kid in foster care, he never foresaw this. Defending a child he didn't know in a world that interpreted skin color faster than words. But his choices now would define them both. A night later, photos circulated. Shaq walking in the neighborhood market with Lennox. No mansion, no luxury, just him and her, buying apples and cheese. The optics changed. Corners softened. Tweets toggled. Why didn't you show that photo earlier, Shaq? Some asked. Others murmured apology. But social media never allows quiet recovery. It consumes mistakes. His team released a part of the shelter footage. He didn't comment. But the images told the story. The mother, the girl. The subtle exchange of trust. No dramatic rescue. Just a mother guiding her child into the world, seeking something unseen. The narrative shifted. Silence became context. That night, he sat beside Lennox in the foyer. He pressed replay on the small tablet he kept for emergencies. She watched the clip. The way her younger self held her mother's hand. The way the woman's face matched the face he'd seen in the photograph at the mansion. When it ended, Lennox nodded slowly, face pale but clearer. That was me. He reached for her hand again. Gentle. And that was your mom. She looked at him. The tension drained, replaced by something diffusing, tender. What now? We find her, he said. No more hiding. His chest tightened. That's when the cameras caught him again. Inside his foyer, tablet glowing, tender fatherly moment. The world saw his vulnerability. The world saw a man willing to risk everything for a little girl. By morning, major media had softened. CEO under fire walking with girl. He claims to protect. Still a story, but now his face was human, not monstrous. One or two outlets even applauded his dignity. More importantly, Lennox didn't flinch when he kissed her forehead in front of the lens. It wasn't victory, but it was a foothold in truth. The cameras didn't see the quilted care behind the headlines. They didn't capture the grit of endurance, the quiet tear he swallowed after she went to sleep. They didn't show him sitting by the window at 2 a.m., planning his search for her mother. All they saw were snapshots rippled by rumor. Inside the mansion, silence returned, but it was not empty. It was deliberate. Lennox grew braver. She asked questions about the screens, the lights, the mansion. He told her. We learned the story one piece at a time. She nodded, like a student ready for lessons life never taught her. In boardrooms and media rooms across the nation, his name wavered, but not bottomless. They knew richness wasn't always optics. Sometimes, it was the willingness to carry shadows, until darkness ended. Racism hadn't gone away. It was the current they swam against. But he refused to let it drown them both. He'd stepped into a fight not through his strength, but through his steadfast choice. Shaq walked through the courtyard before dawn. Lennox's empty doll perched in the fountain basin. He touched the water's edge, reflectively, then closed his eyes. The world saw power in his suit. He saw purpose in his heart. The cameras didn't see that, but he did, and that would always be enough. Secrets don't hide in the dark. They breathe in the corners, waiting to be seen. Late that night, Shaq found himself unable to sleep. The mansion's halls unnaturally silent. Each step he took across the carpeted floors seemed to echo with memories he'd tried to bury. His brother Roman's laugh, their childhood scraped knees, the silence that fell after Roman left home. He wandered down the hall toward his private study, only to be drawn instead into the adjacent wall of family photographs. Each frame held a story. His mother Lucille's graduation glow, his early scholarship awards, community events where his face appeared with warm smiles. But it was the photograph at eye level, a snapshot of Roman and him standing proudly in high school gear, that captured his attention. A few minutes later, as dawn crept through the curtains, Shaq heard faint footsteps behind him. He turned to see Lennox standing in the doorway, her eyes fixed on that very photograph. The amber light from the corridor painted her face in soft gold, and he realized that she wasn't staring. She was studying. Her gaze lingered on Roman's face, pale, strong jawline, bright, hopeful eyes, then shifted to hers. "Who's that?" she asked, voice low. Shaq swallowed, the air in the room tightening, as though resisting his breath. He hesitated, surprised at how fragile he'd become around a child he hardly knew. "That's my brother Roman," he said, clearing his throat. "He died when I was in college." Lennox's face flickered, a curious mix of surprise and recognition. She took a step closer, her words barely audible. "He looks like someone I drew once." The chill in the room deepened. Shaq's heart thudded. He couldn't imagine how she could have even seen Roman. Years ago, his family had retreated from the public eye. He folded his arms, trying to steady his voice. "You drew him." She nodded, staring at the frame as though she could reach through glass. "I didn't know his name. I slipped it in a picture of a woman crying, like I needed someone to know I saw them." Heat rose in Shaq's chest. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. Lennox's mother's diary entry had mentioned the same scenario. Her working in his old neighborhood, bearing witness to someone's pain. The pieces threatened to overwhelm him. Roman dead, 20 years. Lennox's mother working near their old apartment. The drawing of the woman. The coincidences had teeth. He realized he was standing at the threshold of a door he'd long shut. "Come here," he said gently, stepping aside. Lennox moved closer, her small frame dwarfed by the fireplace mantel. He crouched to her level. "Tell me more about your drawing." She tucked a curl behind her ear and gestured toward the blank wall opposite the photograph. It was a big picture of a house with a red door. A woman standing behind it. She looked sad and tired. "I added a man once. Pale hair, kind eyes. I just felt he was part of her story." The silence that followed felt alive. Shaq held himself still, listening to the echoes in that room. His mind raced through old memories. Roman driving by their house on that final night. The heated argument he barely remembered. The sudden disappearance. A photograph. A red door. A crying woman. Lennox's story matched vague ghost traces he'd never dared to follow. Shaq rose and walked to his desk, pulling out an old wooden box. Inside lay Roman's mementos. Notes, trinkets, letters. Shaq never had the courage to read. He removed one item. A folded letter with Roman's handwriting, dated 2 decades ago. Shaq opened it with trembling fingers and read the first line. "I'm sorry I ran. I hope one day you can understand why." His vision blurred. He looked back at Lennox, who watched his reaction with an empathy too large for her age. He closed the letter and placed it on the desk. "Roman wrote this the night he left home. I never read it until now." His voice cracked. "I came back after he didn't answer my calls. But he was gone. No explanation. Just that letter." He paused. "That night I blamed myself." He inhaled, then continued. "And I blamed the world that swallowed him." Lennox looked like she wanted to ask something, but she stayed silent. Shaq reached out and took her hand, placing it on the photograph. "Your picture. I think you saw something in him." "I didn't. Maybe it was Roman's kindness. Maybe it was truth." A flicker of hope passed through Lennox's eyes. "Was he nice?" Shaq closed his eyes. "He was the kindest man I've known." For the first time, they acknowledged a deeper connection. More than accidental, more than random snap of fate. There was design in their shared story. That morning, over breakfast in the sunroom, Shaq processed what they'd uncovered. The drawing. Roman. Lennox's mother working down the street from his childhood home. Every clue pointed backwards into history. Every lead pulled ancient scars to the surface. He asked Lennox more questions, careful not to prod too deep. He learned her mother had worked as a caregiver for elderly residents near Pine Street, where he once lived. She'd often seen a tall black teenager helping with groceries, whistling while he carried them inside. A teenager with a gentle laugh. A face that looked like Roman's. Lennox remembered the teenager told her mother he was going to college, that he never returned. Shaq's throat constricted. "That could have been Roman," he whispered. The room filled with silent contemplation. In that moment, past and present tied themselves in knots. He resolved to learn more. He asked Marisa to search property records on Pine Street, work records for caregivers at the homes where his brother might have helped. He hired Rosalind to dig deeper into Lennox's mother's past in that neighborhood. This was no longer just a missing child case or a public relations battle. It was personal. It was a journey through time that might heal or destroy him. That evening, Shaq returned to the study. Lennox was already in there, drumming her fingers on the scrap of Roman's letter. The room, once suffocating, felt charged with possibility. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Let's do this together," he said. She looked up, eyes steady and determined. "I'm not scared." He nodded, moved to the bookshelf, and pulled out a worn photo album. Inside were old pictures spanning their family history, church events, neighborhood carnivals, Roman's first day of high school. He sat beside her, flipping through pages, until a black and white print fell out. It showed a teenage Roman standing in front of a modest red door house, his expression bright with promise. Shaq recognized it immediately. It matched the drawing Lennox had produced. The red door, the young man, the kind eyes. Lennox gasped softly. Shaq felt a quiver of relief and dread at once. It all pointed to more than coincidence. It suggested a history buried beneath stigma, neglect, and perhaps tragedy. He pressed his thumb to the white border. "This was our first home," he whispered. Before Roman left, she looked up at him. "That's him." The weight of that moment was almost silent. No scream, no shout, just the soft overlap of destiny and memory. Shaq closed the album, slid it onto the desk and whispered, "Secrets don't hide, not forever." That night, he and Lennox sat by the fireplace, reviewing every photograph, every document they'd gathered. The suspense hummed in the corner of the room, tangible and alive. They were detectives of their own history, threading together orphaned clues. With each page, the room's atmosphere shifted. It had gone from suffocating to sacred. Shaq knew they were on the brink of exposure, of discovering Lennox's mother's fate, his brother's path, and the ties that bound them all. The hush between each crackle of the fire felt purposeful, as though truth itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to breathe it back into the world. And when dawn finally came, it brought the solid weight of a promise. Together, they would follow this trail, no matter where it led, because in the room that once stopped breathing, secrets now stirred, and they were ready to be seen. Faith had a way of forgetting those who needed it most. The old brick church, on the corner of Lafayette and Hillside, hadn't changed in decades, and that was both its charm and its curse. The paint still peeled from its weather-beaten doors. The wooden sign out front still read New Morning Baptist, a house of grace. And the bell, though no longer rung, still sat crookedly in the tower like it was waiting for redemption to return. Shaq stood in front of it on a cloudless morning, the past pressing against him like humidity. This was where he used to come as a child, restless in the pews, sneaking peppermints from his mother's purse, watching his brother Roman quietly pray with eyes wide open. He hadn't stepped through those doors since Roman's funeral, and now, as the years had curled around him, life had brought him back with a question no priest could prepare for. Lennox waited in the car with his driver, a puzzle of crayons and paper across her lap, drawing in quiet concentration. Shaq took one last look at her through the tinted glass before climbing the cracked steps. The creak of the door met him like an old sigh, and the sanctuary opened up into the cool stillness of memory. It smelled of cedar and old books, of wax and faint regret. Inside, nothing much had changed. The same wooden pews lined the aisle. The same stained glass cast fractured rainbows across the floor. And the pulpit stood unadorned, no frills, just as it always had under Pastor Greer's hand. And there he was, the same old man, now slower, the slope in his shoulders deeper, polishing the communion table like it was sacred glass. Pastor Greer looked up, squinting as if he needed confirmation. Then a smile cracked the sternness of his face. "Shaquille O'Neal," he said, not as a celebrity, not as a CEO, but as a boy who once snuck out during sermons. "Look what God dragged in." Shaq managed a small smile, and walked forward, embracing the man who once preached about justice, but now carried the scent of resignation. "It's been a long time, Pastor," he said. Greer nodded, eyes misty but curious. "I'd say too long, but time got a way of telling its own stories." He motioned for Shaq to sit, and they settled in the front pew, where dust floated through beams of colored light like forgotten prayers. "I came looking for a woman," Shaq said finally, skipping the pleasantries. I think you knew her. Her name's Lariah. She worked around here years ago. Greer's eyes didn't blink. He leaned back slowly, the weight of recognition seeping through his bones. Lariah Rain, he said, and the name itself hung like incense. Yes. She sat right there. He pointed to the fourth pew on the left. Used to bring her little girl sometimes, Lennox, I believe. Shaq's breath caught. She was here? Greer nodded. Every Sunday, even on the weeks when nobody else came but the echoes. He rubbed his hands together, fingers worn from years of folding in prayer. She was a quiet soul, worked as a homemaid, took care of the shut-ins. Black, white, didn't matter. Always did more than they paid her for. But she carried something heavy. Shaq listened as the story began to take shape, jagged at the edges. She came to me once, Greer continued, after a deacon told her she couldn't sit up front because her daughter might make folks uncomfortable. Said the girl looked too mixed, didn't belong in no church full of black saints. Greer's jaw clenched, but his voice remained soft. I tried to fight it, but the board, well, they didn't see it that way. Shaq shook his head. That's not faith. That's fear wearing a white tie. Greer looked at him, a sadness creeping behind his smile. I told her she didn't need their permission to come to God. But she stopped coming anyway. Said the walls talked louder than the preacher. I should have done more. I failed her. Silence settled again. Outside, birds chirped. Inside, memories crawled through the cracks in the stained glass. Shaq pressed forward. Did she ever mention a man? Someone from the neighborhood? Someone who might be connected to me? He hesitated. To Roman. Greer's eyes flickered. She did. Once. She said the man she loved didn't know he was a father. She didn't say a name, but said he used to help her carry groceries. Tall. Played basketball with neighborhood kids. Always left before the streetlights came on. Shaq's heart thudded in his chest. That was Roman. Greer sighed, rubbing his temples. I thought so. She said he was kind. But he disappeared. Just like that. Left her with more questions than answers. And when her daughter started drawing pictures of him, without ever having seen him again, well, it scared her. Shaq leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The dots were connecting faster now, each revelation a chord in his chest. She left town after that? Not right away, Greer said. She stayed low. Folks around here, especially the white ones, they didn't like her speaking out. She filed a complaint against a supervisor who called her a slur at work. Ended up fired within a week. She told me someone started following her. She said they wanted her quiet. Said they made threats. After that she packed up and vanished. Where'd she go? Greer shook his head. No one knew. I heard whispers she moved somewhere rural. Others say a white family offered her help that turned into something else. He looked down, ashamed. It's what they do to women like her. Silence through kindness. Control disguised as charity. Shaq sat back, eyes closed, absorbing every word. The church had once been a place of comfort, but now it felt like a record of failures. Not personal, not malicious, just the quiet complicity of people who watched injustice and prayed louder instead of standing up. Greer put a hand on Shaq's shoulder. You're trying to do right by that girl. I can see it. But be careful. The people who buried Lariah's stories still run the graveyard. Shaq opened his eyes and stood slowly. Then it's time they lost their shovel. He walked out of the church, not as a man returning home, but as one stepping into war, with truth as his only weapon. Lennox looked up as he got into the car, her drawing now showing a church with boarded windows, and a lone girl standing outside. Shaq reached over and ruffled her hair gently. We're not stopping, he said, voice clear, because if Faith had forgotten Lariah Rain, then he would remember. If the church failed her, then justice would find her, even if it had to rise from the pews where prayer had long gone silent. Children tell the truth. Not with words, but with crayons dipped in nightmares. The morning sunlight seeped through the window panes, stretching across the floor of Shaq's home office, where the silence was usually tranquil. But today, it pulsed with unease. Lennox sat at the edge of the room, her knees pulled up to her chest, a cluster of crayons scattered around her. She wasn't humming or chatting or asking questions. She was drawing, and that, more than anything, made Shaq nervous. Because Lennox didn't draw for fun. She drew when her mind was whispering something it couldn't say aloud. Shaq stood by the bookshelves, watching her. The only sounds in the room were the light scratch of crayon on paper, and the subtle tension in the air. She gripped the red crayon like it meant survival. Her strokes forceful, deliberate. He walked over and crouched beside her as she slid the page slightly away from herself like it had become too heavy to hold. The image jolted him. It wasn't messy or abstract like most children's art. It was calculated. A pristine white house, manicured lawn, symmetrical windows. But all that perfection was broken by the centerpiece. A vivid red door, crooked in its hinges. And behind one pane of glass, a woman with no face, just tears streaming down a featureless head. Shaq looked up at Lennox, his voice barely a whisper. "Who is she?" Lennox didn't look at him. She pointed to the door. "She cries there a lot. I heard her once." She paused, like the air around her was brittle. "I didn't draw the men because they're not always there. Just the door." It remembered. Shaq swallowed hard. His hands closed around the page carefully, as if it could crumble at his touch. He studied the layout. The iron gates sketched along the perimeter, the tall hedges hiding most of the home's view. It wasn't just any house. It was specific, detailed. A memory, not imagination, and it meant something. He took the drawing and moved toward his desk, calling Marisa without hesitation. "I need you to look up gated properties matching this layout within 100 miles of Atlanta," he said. "Big house, red door, probably with a wrought iron fence and trimmed hedges." She didn't ask questions. On it. As he hung up, Lennox stood silently behind him. "It's not far," she said. "I remember the drive. They told Mama we'd be safe." Shaq turned to her. "They? Who are they?" She only shrugged. "I don't know. They had suits. And sunglasses. They talked to Mama like they were helping." That chilled him more than any answer. The drawing wasn't just a memory. It was a breadcrumb. A child's witness statement. In color. And every instinct in him said, this wasn't just about poverty or abandonment. This was something darker. Something calculated. Something hiding behind the facade of help. Later that afternoon, Marisa called with a list of 5 properties that matched the drawing. One stood out. A private estate in Fayette County, belonging to a man named Pierce Landon, a real estate developer and political donor known for philanthropy by day and closed-door events by night. His estate matched the sketch perfectly, down to the iron gate and red door, and he had once quietly acquired a nonprofit that offered shelter and discretion to struggling single mothers. Shaq's stomach knotted. Discretion in the wrong hands was a smokescreen. That evening, he drove past the estate. He didn't stop, didn't take photos. He just needed to see it. The house loomed like a fairy tale gone wrong. Pristine white walls, lights perfectly spaced, the red door standing in sharp contrast like a warning sign. It was the same house Lennox had drawn. Without a doubt, a camera near the front gate pivoted in his direction, and he pulled away before being seen. Back at home, he found Lennox asleep on the couch, her crayon-streaked fingers wrapped around another sketch. This one was different. Darker. A hallway inside the house, cold and windowless, and a single word scribbled over and over again on the walls. Quiet. It wasn't a child's doodle. It was a memory crawling through her skin. Shaq sat beside her and slowly peeled the page from her hand, heart pounding. If this was what she remembered, then the house wasn't just a shelter. It was a prison, possibly worse. The next morning he met with Rosalind, the investigative reporter he trusted. He handed her both drawings and told her everything Lennox had shared. She raised her eyebrows, concern etching across her face. This could get dangerous, she warned. People who do things like this don't like spotlights. They operate in shadows. I'm not afraid of them, Shaq replied. But I need truth. If this connects to trafficking or abuse, especially through a charitable front, I want it exposed. I want their names. I want their money to choke them. Rosalind nodded. Then let's shake the walls. Within days she returned with preliminary findings. The nonprofit connected to Pierce Landon had quietly rerouted several women to private properties without ever documenting their intake or release. Lennox's mother had registered for help there under an alias, Leah Moore, and had been listed as relocated for mental health reasons. But no hospital ever admitted her. The implication hit hard. Lennox's mother had been disappeared behind a red door no one dared to knock on, and the man who funded it all shook hands with senators. That evening, Shaq sat with Lennox again. He showed her an old yearbook photo of his brother, and then a picture of Pierce Landon. Her reaction to the second was instant. She pushed the tablet away. That's the man who said Mama was confused. He inhaled sharply. Are you sure? She nodded once, then buried her head in a pillow. He stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the horizon. This wasn't just about custody or DNA or legacy anymore. It was about power, how easily it erased women like Lariah Rain, how it used words like protection and privacy to hide exploitation. Shaq didn't sleep that night. He made calls, arranged a legal strategy, brought in child advocacy groups he'd worked with before, and ensured Lennox was surrounded by witnesses, not secrets. But he didn't just want to protect her. He wanted to burn down the structure that let this happen. Because children don't lie about monsters. They just draw them with bright red doors. And somewhere behind one of those doors, Lariah Rain was either waiting or gone. But one thing was certain. Shaq would not stop until he opened it. Behind every perfect lawn, there might be a scream buried 6 feet under. In the hush before sunrise, Big Shaq slipped into the passenger seat of Marissa's black SUV. Her gaze was steady in the rearview mirror as they drove toward the Fayette County estate, winding between magnolia trees and past wrought iron gates that glittered under streetlights. Every mile dragged his heart deeper into uncertainty. Lennox's drawing, the secrecy, the unsettling quiet, all led here. Marissa parked 100 yards from the Red Door house. Shaq exited, clutching a small camera and notebook, as if they were lifelines. Approaching the iron fence, the morning birdsong felt wrong, too soft, like nature covering a secret. Through trimmed hedges, Shaq saw the pristine white facade, the iconic red door exactly as Lennox had drawn it, surveillance cameras perched under eaves, swiveling methodically. He took notes, heart pounding. Wealth had always been power, but this was power hidden behind glass lenses. Cameras were no defense, they were silence-bearer enforcers. Marissa whispered beside him, pointing to a black sedan in the garage. She zoomed in with her phone. License registered to Pierce Landon. Your man. A gravity pulled at Shaq's chest. He walked to the driveway's edge, eyes scanning the property line. No welcoming sign, no pathway for flowers, just bushes trimmed to deny access rather than beautify. He circled the yard until he spotted the housekeeper, a middle-aged woman in a neat uniform, eyes downcast, hair tied tight. Shaq approached cautiously. She stiffened, then managed a polite smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice cool as steel. He showed his press pass. He'd arranged a faux identity as a historical researcher. He spoke with confidence, masked as interest. "I'm investigating local charity estates. I heard this one helped single mothers." He saw the moment her eyes flicked just a flash at the red door. A hesitation, and she said, "I don't know her, sir." Her words hit him like cold water. "What about property history? Who's lived here before?" He paced slowly, watching her. "Just the Landon family. They bought it 10 years ago." She glanced at the surveillance cameras overhead and tightened her grip on her handbag. "I can show you around the rose garden." If she broke off as if she remembered something else, then forced back. "That's all I know, sir." Shaq nodded politely and backed away. He turned toward the rear of the house where he found a service door ajar. Gently, so as not to slam it and alert the cameras, he pushed it open. A narrow hallway led to a pantry, empty shelves, a few cleaning supplies, and tiled floors that hummed under his shoes. This room, functional and forgotten, connected inside the home. He paused. Someone had entered here recently. A footprint marked in dust. He photographed it, heart thumping. Then he found a small utility closet. Against the back wall, hidden behind a mop, lay a battered leather-bound journal, edges frayed and spine cracked. He opened it carefully. The first entries were dated 2 years ago. Handwriting matched documents from the shelter. He read a passage. "He smiles at me, but never stays." Veils of silence cover his teeth. "Lennox asks me daily where he is. I have no answer. I can say, they say I'm unwell, but I know what I've seen. I am not lost." His breath caught. The writing stopped mid-sentence. Next page is empty. The pen still lay inside, ink dry but intent intact. Shaq closed the journal and pressed it to his chest like a fragile heart. Step by step, he retraced his path to the front of the house. Each glint of surveillance glass and iron fence felt like witnesses watching him steal truth. He captured another photo of the license plate, bracketed the camera's view, then backed into the hazy glow of dawn. Back in the SUV, he held the journal open. Marissa's eyes were wide. "We don't know what happened here," he said. "But she was here, Marissa, and she left this." He tapped the page. She tried to make her voice heard in writing. Jesus. She thinks they left her trapped. Marissa exhaled slowly. And now we have proof. We just need to connect the dots without tripping alarms. Shaq nodded. We find the edges. His voice hardened. We need witnesses, rule documents, anything tying Lennox's mother to this house. Then we expose the lie of Charity. He placed the journal gently in his briefcase. A tear welled in his eye. Laria's words haunting him. She'd existed here. She'd feared and hoped. In some rooms she'd whispered to walls, taped pleas to cabinet doors, hiding her story until she couldn't anymore. Surveillance or not, Shaq realized they were far from safe. The property was coated with intimidation, but he refused to let silence win. He leaned forward, took Maurice's hand. For her, he whispered, voice raw, for Lennox and the mother she never met. She nodded, determination in her eyes. We push. They drove away from the Red Door house, leaving behind the estate's manicured facade and hidden truths. But Shaq felt every secret inside that home pressing against him like a warning. No scream had come yet, but he could feel it buried there waiting for its moment, and he wouldn't leave it waiting any longer. Sometimes justice wears the wrong tie. Shaq had always known what power looked like. Boardrooms, corner offices, tailored suits. He'd mastered every room he walked into. But this morning, as he adjusted his tie in the reflection of the tinted courtroom window, the fabric clung tighter than usual. It wasn't the size that was wrong. It was the context. The suit wasn't built for defense. It was built for projection. And now it was the wrong uniform for a man accused. It started 2 days ago with a phone call he didn't expect. A detective's voice, smooth but sharp, requested his presence for a voluntary statement. Shaq knew what that meant. Someone had filed a report, anonymous of course, claiming he was endangering a minor, not abuse, not assault, but undue psychological influence. It sounded vague enough to be dangerous and clear enough to poison reputations. He arrived at the precinct without fanfare, without press. He didn't bring his legal team, just Marissa and his silence. The room they placed him in was cold and gray, the air dense with practiced neutrality. The officers weren't aggressive. In fact, they were polite, disarmingly so. That was what worried him. We received concerns about a young girl under your guardianship. One officer said, his pen already hovering. They allege irregular custody arrangements, possible emotional coercion, and suggestions that her mother's whereabouts are being deliberately obscured. Shaq leaned forward. Her mother disappeared long before I found Lennox. I've been trying to find her. I've documented everything. The officer nodded slowly. And yet you haven't handed her over to Child Services. Shaq's jaw tightened. Child Services lost her the first time. I wasn't going to repeat their mistake. The officer wrote something down slowly, intentionally, and didn't respond. By the time he left, cameras were waiting outside. The leak had been swift and deliberate. Headlines followed faster than truth could crawl. Big Shaq under investigation for custody. Irregularities. Talk shows debated his motives. Commentators questioned his mental state. One anchor called him another narcissistic billionaire playing savior. Shaq didn't flinch, but he felt every jab. His boardroom phone stopped ringing. Business partners who once bragged about knowing him pulled back. Emails went unanswered. A tech deal he was finalizing, the acquisition of a startup aimed at funding education in underserved Black communities, was suddenly paused for internal review. He knew what that meant. He walked into his office that Friday and found the atmosphere changed. Staff whispered behind glass. An investor who once toasted him with 100-year-old whiskey now avoided eye contact. Felicia Grant, his PR director, met him in his office with a thick file. We need to release a timeline and personal statement, she said, breathlessly efficient. You're losing optics. Sympathy doesn't live long in the court of public opinion. Shaq stared at her. You want me to spin a little girl's trauma into a digestible brand statement? Felicia hesitated. I want you to stay in control of the narrative. He turned away. Then tell the truth. Felicia sighed. The truth doesn't trend, Shaq. Accusations do. Later that day, he received a letter, unsigned but official. An ethics committee from the Urban Equity Fund was initiating a review of his foundation's conduct. He was no longer invited to the annual roundtable. The reason? Conflict of public trust. He stood at the edge of his private office, looking down at the city he once ruled, and for the first time in years, he felt outside the system he helped build. This wasn't just slander, it was architecture, engineered skepticism, aimed at his color, his stature, and his refusal to play submissive when the stakes got moral. That evening, he found Lennox on the rooftop garden, drawing again. She didn't ask about the news. She didn't seem to notice the storm brewing. Instead, she handed him a new picture. This one of a courtroom. A small girl in the center, surrounded by men in suits with blank faces. At the top of the picture, in neat child handwriting, she'd written, "They don't see her." He knelt beside her. "Why did you draw this?" She pointed to the faceless figures. "Because none of them looked at her eyes." He touched the paper, throat tight. "And what should they see?" Lennox looked at him, voice firm. "That she's not lying." At that moment the noise faded. Not because it stopped, but because Shaq remembered why he could never. He wasn't fighting for the press. He was fighting for truth in a courtroom that never fit his skin. The next day, he walked into the Department of Family Services and filed an official petition for temporary guardianship. The clerk looked surprised. "You're voluntarily coming here?" she asked, disbelief in her tone. Shaq nodded. "Because I don't hide. I protect." The story didn't go away, but something changed. For every anchor casting doubt, a social worker spoke up about broken systems. For every whisper in a boardroom, there was a teacher who posted about Lennox's smile. Slowly, silently, justice began to untangle itself from its crooked tie. But Shaq knew, this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of war. A war where truth wore no suit at all. Truth doesn't scream. It whispers from the wreckage. The box arrived without warning. A plain brown package. No return address. No postmark. Just Shaq's name scribbled in fine pen across the top. Marisa found it on the front steps of the office, nestled like a forgotten errand. Suspicion clung to it immediately. Shaq opened it in private, heart already braced. Inside, a battered voice recorder, scuffed and aged, the kind used by journalists a decade ago. And one cassette, labeled simply, "Play me if you still care about the truth." He stared at it for a long time before pressing play. The audio crackled to life, and then her voice, the first time he'd ever heard it, slipped through the static. Laria Rain, Lennox's mother, fragile and furious. Every word clutched at him. "If you're hearing this, then I either got out or I didn't." Her tone was steady, but the undercurrent of dread was unmistakable. "I kept records. Of everyone. I worked in that house for 6 months. Pierce Landon wasn't just laundering his guilt in that mansion. He used it as a front to manipulate women who had nowhere to go. If they questioned anything, they were called unstable. They threatened to take Lennox from me if I didn't keep quiet. But I saw too much. I saw deals made, contracts signed, money passed between men who talked about rezoning and urban clearance." Shaq sat down slowly. The static surged briefly before her voice returned, tighter now. "One of those men was Senator Claymore. He didn't know I recognized him. But he was there. And the house was never just a house. It was a filter for selecting which mothers to silence, which children to relocate. This wasn't charity, it was design. The air in the room thickened. The light outside dimmed as clouds rolled over the city, like the weather itself knew what was being uncovered. Then her voice cracked. For the first time. "And Roman didn't know. I never told him about Lennox. He disappeared before I could. And when I finally went back to that church, your mother saw me. She didn't speak, but she knew. I think she knew Lennox was his." Shaq's breath left his lungs. The floor beneath him might as well have cracked open. Lennox was Roman's daughter. He paused the tape, the room dead silent except for the faint hum of electricity. It all made sense now. Her familiarity with Roman's photo, the way she drew him, the red door house, the fear in her mother's voice. Lennox didn't just come into his life by coincidence. She was family. His blood. When he pressed play again, Laria's voice returned softer, resolved. "If anything happens to me, don't let them tell Lennox I was weak. Don't let them bury me in lies. She's not just a child. They're afraid of what she knows, of what she'll become." The tape ended. Shaq sat still for minutes, staring at the machine like it had become sacred. He reached for his phone and called Rosalind. She answered instantly. "I need to meet. I have proof." "What kind?" "The kind that could burn down political careers," he said, "and clear the name of a woman they tried to erase." They met that evening in a small law firm Shaq trusted. He played the recording 3 times while Rosalind took notes, her hands trembling on the second run. She stopped the tape midway through the 4th, looked him in the eye and said, "This changes everything, but you realize, going public with this will make you their target." Shaq didn't blink. "I've been a target all my life. I'm just not standing still anymore." Later that night, he found Lennox curled up on the couch, asleep with a half-finished drawing on her lap.
This one was different.
It showed three people: herself, a faceless woman, and a man she'd drawn before, Roman. But this time, the man's hand rested on her shoulder. There was a sunrise behind them. He sat beside her, quiet, and for the first time in his adult life, tears rolled down his cheeks without warning, without shame. Not for the damage, but for the dawn. Because now the truth had a voice, and it belonged to her. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, but none wanted the truth. The morning after the recording surfaced, the world didn't pause, it pounced. News vans camped outside Shaq's gates like they were waiting for a gladiator match. Headlines splashed in red and black: "Tech tycoon or savior scammer." Big Shaq's little secret: was it all a publicity stunt? It didn't matter that Rosalind had vetted the tape, or that Lariah Rain's voice trembled with authenticity. The media didn't chase truth, they chased spectacle. And Shaq, he was the ringmaster they wanted to see fall. Every influencer, podcaster, and opinion peddler weighed in. Politicians sidestepped questions about Senator Claymore. Talk shows cut to stock photos of Lennox like she was part of a commercial. One right-wing blogger claimed Shaq fabricated the entire story to distract from a deep-state tech coup. Another accused him of brainwashing Lennox. Some even suggested the girl wasn't real, just a crisis actor. Shaq watched it all unfold on multiple screens. In his study, face unreadable, Lennox sat beside him, eyes flicking between channels. He could feel the tension in her body, how even at her age, she understood the weight of being misunderstood. When a commentator called her a pawn, her small fingers curled into fists. He reached over, turned off every screen, and said quietly, "They've had their turn, now it's ours." An hour later, Shaq made the decision. He wouldn't issue a press release. He wouldn't grant a high-profile interview. He would speak directly to the people in the one place that had always belonged to the truth: the town hall. The event was arranged within 12 hours. The venue, a community center in West Atlanta, the same one where Roman once volunteered tutoring kids. The announcement spread through word of mouth and Shaq's official channels. He didn't bring lawyers or a PR team. He didn't even draft a speech. When he arrived that evening, the auditorium was packed. Folding chairs lined every corner. Reporters sat near single mothers, retirees, barbers, teachers, skeptics, and supporters. Everyone had an opinion, and none of them left it at the door. Shaq stepped onto the modest wooden stage without fanfare. He wore no suit this time, just jeans and a navy pullover. The air buzzed with anticipation, with doubt, with hope tethered to reality. He stood behind the mic, paused and said, "You've heard their stories. Now hear mine." He didn't yell. He didn't defend. He told the truth. About the park, about Lennox's words, about the red door, about the journal, about the tape. Every sentence was a nail in the coffin of speculation. And yet, he never begged for belief. He simply placed the facts in front of them, like puzzle pieces, and let the room assemble its own understanding. Then he said something no one expected. "Lennox is Roman's daughter. My niece. I didn't know when I found her, but I think somewhere in my soul, I recognized her. She didn't need a miracle. She needed someone who wouldn't walk away." The room went silent. And then from the side of the stage, Lennox walked out, quiet, brave, dressed in her favorite yellow hoodie. She clutched a worn piece of paper. Shaq knelt beside her, whispering, "You sh—" She nodded. She stepped to the mic, and in a voice so soft the room bent to hear it, she read, "When people see me, they guess who I belong to. But I'm not a rumor. I'm not a headline. I'm Lennox Rain. I remember my mom crying behind a red door. I remember thinking, no one saw us. But he did." She pointed at Shaq. He didn't look away. Her voice didn't crack. It carried, and something broke in that room. Not a cry, not applause, but a stillness too big to fake. The kind of quiet only truth could earn. After she finished, the crowd didn't explode. They stood, slow and reverent, giving her not applause, but witness. Later that night, as they drove home in silence, Shaq looked over at Lennox. She stared out the window, expression calm. "You did something big tonight," he said. She smiled faintly. "I didn't want them to forget her." He nodded. They won't. Because in a parade of pretenders, one child's truth had turned every camera lens back toward the light. Some names are meant to be spoken only when the soul is ready to carry them. The news came not as a shout, but as a whisper from a cracked doorway. A call from Rosalind, at 6:12 a.m., her voice low, tired, and trembling, not from fear but awe. "Shaq," she said, "we found her. Laria Rain. She's alive." Shaq stood in the center of his living room, phone pressed to his ear, heart frozen in the space between hope and panic. Rosalind explained she had traced a tip from a former shelter employee. A private clinic, hidden under a nonprofit's shell account, had been treating Laria off the books for nearly a year. No ID, no contact listed. They called her Patient Gold. Shaq arrived at the facility before the hour turned over. The building stood quiet, tucked between a deserted car wash and a chain pharmacy. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered as if uncertain they still had a job. A nurse, kind but cautious, led him to a small room with a window covered by blinds drawn so tightly they looked like scars. Laria sat on a narrow bed, her figure smaller than he imagined, face thinner, but her eyes, those same quiet eyes Lennox wore when she was afraid, watched him with something closer to recognition than surprise. Shaq entered slowly, stopping just inside the room.
"Laria?"
She blinked once, then twice, and her shoulders dropped like a soldier finally hearing the ceasefire. "You're Roman's brother," she said softly. Shaq exhaled, knees nearly giving out. "You remember him?" "I never forgot him," she whispered. "I just thought I had to disappear for Lennox to live." He moved to the chair beside her bed and sat, unsure where to begin. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just tender. "I have her," he said finally. "She's safe." Her lower lip quivered. "Does she know?" "Everything," he said. "She knows she's loved. She knows the truth." Laria nodded, looking away. "They told me if I stayed quiet she'd have a chance. That I was unstable, irrational. But I wasn't sick. I was just a black woman trying to scream in a system built on silence." Shaq reached for her hand, and she let him hold it. Her skin was cold, but her grip was steady. "You don't owe them any explanation," he said. "You survived. That's enough." She closed her eyes, and for a long moment, they sat like that, two people bound not by blood, but by the wreckage of someone who mattered to them both. When Laria finally spoke again, it was barely a breath. "Roman never knew. He would have stayed if I told him. He wasn't the kind of man to run. But I didn't want to trap him. I thought I'd disappear before they came for him too." Shaq shook his head, the grief sharp in his chest. "He died not knowing he had a daughter, but I promise you, I'll carry that name. For both of you." Later that day, Laria agreed to see Lennox. The clinic arranged a quiet room. No cameras, no press, just a mother and daughter, and the ache between them. When Lennox entered, she froze in the doorway. Her hands gripped the drawing she had been working on. Unfinished, waiting for something. Laria stood slowly. "Hi, baby." Lennox didn't run. She didn't speak. She just stared. Then, step by step, she crossed the room and placed the drawing in her mother's hands. It was a house. Not the red door one. A new one. Plain. Unpainted. But beside it stood two figures. One tall, one small. A wind was blowing in the background, curling their hair like a memory. Laria knelt and whispered, "I'm sorry." Lennox touched her cheek and said, "I know." Shaq stepped back from the door and let the moment hold. Days passed. The clinic cleared Laria for release under Shaq's care. The media didn't find out, because he didn't let them. Instead, he brought her home quietly. Not for spectacle, for healing. One evening, sitting in the garden, Laria looked at Shaq and said, "I never had a family before him, and I thought I'd lost it when he died. But maybe family isn't blood. Maybe it's who stays." Shaq nodded. "Then we stay." And when the wind picked up, Lennox stepped between them, her small hand rising to catch it. Because now, her name had roots. And the wind finally had a place to rest. Sometimes one day is all it takes to become someone's forever. The courthouse was nothing special. No grand pillars or polished marble floors. Just tired tile and walls the color of old oatmeal. But that morning, to Shaq it felt like hallowed ground. Lennox stood beside him in a navy dress with yellow stars, clutching a small teddy bear that had become her silent companion. Across from them, Laria sat beside a court-appointed advocate, looking stronger than the woman he had met weeks ago. Still thin, still healing, but her eyes were whole now, and her voice no longer trembled when she spoke. The judge, an older black woman named Justice Marin, adjusted her glasses and looked down from the bench. Mr. O'Neill, Miss Rain, are you both prepared to confirm this custody transfer? Shaq nodded once. I am. Lariah did too. He's the only one I trust with her future, and she already trusts him with her heart. The judge looked at Lennox. Young lady, do you have anything to say? Lennox looked up, her small voice rising with clarity. He doesn't pretend to be my dad. He already is. The gavel fell once. Just once. Outside, a quiet crowd waited. Not media this time, but community members, neighbors, people who had watched the story unfold and rooted quietly, off camera. There were no fireworks, just hugs, handshakes, quiet nods, and tears that didn't demand an audience. Later that week, Shaq stood in front of a new building, glass, steel and brick, with a name inscribed in silver across the front, the Lennox Rain Foundation. It wasn't just a charity, it was a reckoning. A center built to house children lost in the bureaucratic fog of neglect, a legal division to challenge unjust removals, mental health resources, shelters, scholarships, and most importantly, an investigative unit built to expose the hidden exploitation buried under the language of help. Lennox stood beside him at the ribbon cutting. Lariah too, and when reporters asked what the foundation's purpose was, Shaq answered simply, to make sure no child has to ask a stranger to pretend again. That night, the city was quiet. The noise had faded. The questions had died down. And in the garden behind Shaq's home, Lennox sat wrapped in a blanket, staring at the sky. Shaq joined her, watching as the last stars began to dissolve into the coming morning. She leaned against him, her voice barely a whisper. Do you think he knows? Shaq didn't ask who. He didn't need to. I think Roman sees everything now, he said. And I think he's proud of you. Lennox turned to him. And of you? Shaq looked away, then nodded. Maybe. I just wish I could have told him the truth sooner. They fell into silence again, letting the first light touch their skin. The wind was soft, not demanding, just there like it always had been. And then, without hesitation, Lennox said it. Daddy. Not like she was testing it. Not like she needed permission. Just the truth. Shaq didn't respond right away. His throat tightened too much, but he wrapped his arm around her, and together they watched the sun rise. He was only supposed to be her father for a day, but one day, always. If this story moved you, if it made you think, feel, or simply see the world a little differently, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful, real, and emotionally gripping stories that matter. Hit that like button if Lennox's journey and Big Shaq's courage left a mark on you. And most importantly, share this story, because someone out there needs to hear it. Let's build a community that stands for truth, love, and the kind of stories that don't just entertain, but wake people up.